Hey, welcome to Dan's Model Works, and today we are starting part 2 of our 2Ts by AMT. And in case you haven't seen part 1, the AMT Fruitwagon kit will produce a classic Model T and a hot rod. The classic Model T we're going to be building as a pickup truck, and the hot rod we're going to do as mild as we possibly can. So we have the engine block for the hot rod put together, and then we have the classic engine put together. As well as that, we've got the rear axle, and here's the frame for the hot rod. Interesting to compare to the stock Model T frame right here. So, I think we're going to start off by gluing the engine into the stock frame. I don't think we're anywhere near that stage with the hot rod yet, but we'll get there. Alright, there's our classic T engine installed. Now, as I stated in part 1, one of the things that I resolved to do with this kit, and hopefully will carry out, is I'm actually going to put the wiring in for the spark plug wires and stuff. Now, I know there's companies that sell wire for 1/25 scale engines to put your spark plug wires in. However, none of my local hobby shops here have got any in stock. I suppose I could order some. That would probably take a while. So, my first thought was, maybe I'll just use the finest wire that I can easily obtain. So I had a spool of regular Bell extension wire for installing your telephones and things. And when you strip that down, you get 4 conductors like this. And they are pretty fine, but they're not stranded, so they tend to have quite a bit of stiffness to them and that. The other thing is if I put it up to the engine block, there we go, it does still look a little bit heavy for spark plug wire. I think I'm going to go out and I'm going to do some more searching and see if I can find something finer. There is a store I have in mind where I might be able to find something finer and possibly, some other ideas. Okay, we're here at one of the coolest stores in my town, and we're going to be looking for some really fine wire that we can use to simulate spark plug wires. I'm sure every town has a surplus store like this. Ours happens to be connected to a giant flea market, so we're going to see what we can find. Well, this looks like it'd be the right size wire. Unfortunately, it's white. Suppose I could use it and put a little bit of black paint on it or something. We'll ask and see if they've got some in a different color. Alright, we're back from our explorations of the surplus stores, and this is the Bell wire here, the Bell telephone wire, and this is the wire that I picked up at the surplus store. Unfortunately, they didn't have any other color other than white. Maybe sometime in the future I'll look at an actual electronics part supply store, but I figure I can always put a little bit of black paint on this wire after I install it. It certainly is a lot finer and a lot more flexible. So I think we'll try using this wire here and see how that works. So I figure the first step in putting the spark plug wires in is I need to create a distributor cap. So this piece here came off of a chrome sprue of some previous model. It had approximately the right shape. What I need to do is, because this is a V8, I need to drill 8 indentations in the top so that I've got something kind of to anchor the wires into so that the glue has something to bite. Okay, it's a little hard to see, but there are 8 small holes drilled in the top of this part. Now I've got to design a base for this distributor cap to fit on, basically go on the rear of the engine, which, as far as I can tell from my research, is where the distributor cap should go on a Lincoln Y block. Now, from the pictures that I've seen, the distributor seems to come off of a housing at an angle like this at the back of the couple engines that I have seen. So I've already notched this part of this piece of tubing so that when I glue it on, it'll form a body that the distributor cap can fit on. Now I want this to be reasonably robust, because I get the feeling when I put all those little wires on it, it's going to want to go ka-twing. So I want to make sure I've got this part on really well. I've made another addition to the engine block here. As you can see through the pulley, there's a bracket coming up that will support the generator. Now the pulley and the generator still aren't actually glued on yet. I want to be able to take those off while I'm doing the spark plug wires. But when the time comes, I'll be able to put a drop of super glue between the generator and this bracket, and that avoids the old floating alternator slash generator that you so often get in model kits. And on the back side here, you can see I've glued the housing that the distributor cap is going to mount onto. This is probably a little oversized. It actually looks more like a rod coming up that the distributor is mounted on the real engines. But I wanted to go a little bit heavier just so the distributor is firmly mounted on there. Okay, you're looking at probably attempt number 3 for this particular wire. I did have a wire on there. It looked pretty darn good. And then while putting the first wire on this side, I had it go spring 2 or 3 times, and each time, I don't know where the wire went, but I wasn't able to find it. Then I had that wire almost on, and then this wire came off. And at that point, I was so pissed off, I was ready to toss the whole thing across the basement. So, it's been a few days, and we're going to go back to it, see what we can do here. Alright, after a lot of cursing, I finally have another spark plug wire glued in place. I'm going to set this aside, let everything set before I try to put number 3 on. And don't anybody dare saying, you know what, those wires aren't coming off in the right firing order. I really, at this point, don't care. I want to have 8 wires basically going from the distributor cap to the spark plugs, and that's going to have to be good enough. Alright, we got 3 on, making some progress. Alright, as you can see, finally, 8 spark plug wires going to the distributor cap. Now it is true, in order to achieve this, I had to sell one of my children's soul to the devil. I won't say which one, they can figure it out when the time comes. At any rate, they're on there. Next step, I'm going to take some Tamiya rubber. I'm going to use that because the acrylic paint will probably stick a little bit better to the slightly flexible wires. Then I'll have to touch up the engine block. From the amount of handling, I've actually worn the paint off of the transmission, so that'll have to be renewed. And there we go. Now it's all the wires are painted up and the distributor cap is painted up. Now we need to start working on the carburetor and the air filter air intake. Now, while I've been messing around with the wiring, I've actually been working on the classic T. I will be putting the wires in from the spark plugs, but they actually go to the firewall on the original Model T. The interesting thing is how much of the structure the engine makes up in a Model T. You've got the front suspension there actually mounts to the bottom of the block. But at any rate, this is coming along. I haven't been neglecting the hot rod frame either. I have the front spring, shock absorbers, the front axle on, and the rear spring in place. I'm suspecting that I'm probably going to be toning these down a little bit, maybe using silver or steel as opposed to bright chrome. There is a nice detail on these leaf springs, though. They're really well molded. So, I mean, although this kit has its shortcomings, it was pretty good for its day, and I think it'll still build up to be a nice kit. I've installed the fan, and at the same time, I filed down the fan blades, because on almost every model kit, the fan blades are always about an inch thick, which hardly looks realistic. One surprising thing is I don't know how many car kits I've built where the fan is inevitably chromed, which is probably the last thing you want it to be. On this hot rod, where it's quite conceivable that the fan would be chromed, they give it to you as a white part. Now I know by the time I would file down the blades, it wouldn't be chrome anyway, but I just thought it was a funny thing to point out. I still need to touch up a lot of the paint on the engine. However, I will be installing it in the chassis because in order to put the other suspension part on here in the differential, I need to be able to locate it to the back of the engine. So I'm going to be putting the engine in, even though I still have to do the carburetor and the air intake on top of it. To create the air intake slash air cleaner, I need a fairly substantial block. I don't have a piece of styrene thick enough. So what I've done is I've laminated 4 pieces together, and then I'll let that dry, and then I'll start carving it to shape. After the glue dried on my manufactured block, I started cutting it to the rough shape that we're going to want for the air cleaner for the hot rod. A few minutes filing, and the shape is getting to be closer to what we want. I still have to round off pretty much the entire top area there to get the shape we're looking for. I think I'm happy with that shape. It's probably not exact, but I think it's close enough. Now you may be wondering how I'm going to put that cool mesh effect all over it. And I'm going to use mesh. I picked this up at a local hobby shop that actually specializes in model trains. And when I saw the part that I wanted to build, this is the material I instantly thought of. So I went there and they had 1 package left, which is pretty cool. And I'm basically going to be laminating this over the part, and then I'll paint it silver and add some black washes, hopefully to give it the 3D effect we need. I've glued the mesh on top of the part, and now that the glue is set up and hopefully it's not going to go popping off, I'm just going to cut the mesh at the corners, and then I'm going to wrap it underneath, and hopefully it will come out looking fairly smooth and neat. Alright, there's my air cleaner air filter with the mesh wrapped around it. And all I did was I soaked it with regular Tester's model cement, just enough so that the plastic would soften up and tend to gooey around the mesh a little bit. Seemed to work better than super glue, which really wasn't having any effect at all. I've added a carburetor to the top of the engine, and it's not intending to represent any specific type of carburetor. This is basically a cool looking part that I took from some other kit. It basically has a carburetor-ish look to it, and I'll be mounting the air cleaner on top of that. Now I wanted to just say a word about the alternatives for doing spark plug wires. Now, as I said before, I plan on obtaining some proper model spark plug material wire. This, of course, is what I picked up at the surplus store. I also picked up some tubing. Now, there's no metal inside this, but this is actually intended for electronics and wiring, and you slip it over the joint where you've joined wires together. You heat it up and it shrinks down. And it's pretty good too, but it just looked a little bit too beefy for what we were looking for. Although this would probably make a good hose or something like that. Over here, we have some fine electronics solder. And it's pretty fine. But once again, not quite as fine as I wanted. And it has a lot of memory to it. Once you put a kink in it, it stays that way. Now, I also went to Michael's, which is an art supply store. And this material, it's called Stretch Magic, and it's 1 millimeter in diameter, or 0.039 inch. This as well does not have a metal core to it, and it is really, really flexible. But it was slightly thicker than the original wire, so I didn't use it. But once again, I might use it for a hose for a future project. Finally, I picked up this, which is monofilament wire. Here we go. This is basically fishing line, only black. And this is really, really fine. Once again, if you need to do some other standalone wiring, this might work out really good. This as well I got from Michael's. So here's some ideas If you need to do wiring, not necessarily spark plug wiring, you might consider these alternatives. So this pretty much concludes part 2 of our 2Ts by AMT. And here's the chassis and the engine for the classic Model T, which is going to be a pickup truck. And then we have the chassis for and the engine for the hot rod, which has definitely taken up more time than the classic Model T. And let's just zoom in close here so you can see the air intake air cleaner that's mounted on top that I just finished scratch building. Now I might dry brush it with some silver just to brighten it up a bit. I've just put a black wash on it to give it more depth. Hopefully in part 3 we'll finally get to working on the body. I was thinking that these would be rolling chassis by the end of this part, but we haven't quite got there yet. So until next time, thanks for watching Dan's Model Works and keep on modeling.